I'm particularly thrilled that Professor Taylor is with us this week for 3 lectures, and also for the better part of 2 weeks as part of this project, and he'll be interacting with faculty and students in smaller venues as well. Let me say a little bit about the Berkeley Center and about the lectures before turning it over to President DeGioia, who will introduce our speaker. The Berkeley Center's 2.5 years old now. It was created in the President's office as part of a university-wide effort to make Georgetown a global leader in the interdisciplinary study of religion and in the promotion of interreligious understanding. It's an effort that seeks to build on some of our strengths here at Georgetown, our academic strengths, our location in Washington, D.C., our international networks, and on a Catholic and Jesuit identity that is open to other religious traditions and to the wider secular world. The Berkeley Center Lectures, an annual event, are an opportunity to bring a global thought leader to campus, to carry on a conversation, extended conversation with students and faculty on issues at the intersection of religion, society, and politics in our contemporary world. It's now my pleasure to introduce President DeGioia, who will introduce Professor Taylor. Dr. DeGioia is well known to everyone in this room. He's served as president of Georgetown since 2001, and before that served more than 2 decades in administrative positions as senior vice president, for example, as dean of student affairs. He received his Bachelor of Arts in English from Georgetown and his PhD in philosophy. And as president, he has continued to teach courses in the philosophy department on topics including the practice of leadership and ethics and global development. Dr. DeGioia is a member of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO and chair of its Education Committee, and he represents Georgetown in multiple venues, including the World Economic Forum and the Council on Foreign Relations. And it is under his leadership that our work at the Berkeley Center on Religion and Interreligious Understanding and similar work across our campus has flourished. So please join me in welcoming President DeGioia.
Thank you very much, Tom, and welcome everyone. It's an honor to join you this afternoon, and I would like to express my deep appreciation to Tom and to Professor Jose Casanova of our Berkeley Center for putting these lectures in place. We have an extraordinary opportunity together as a community over the course of these next few days to have the privilege of listening to Professor Charles Taylor, 3 lectures on narratives of secularity. Our lecturer, Charles Taylor, is an internationally recognized philosopher in the areas of modernity, secularity, and religion, someone who the late Richard Rorty said in 1996 was, quote, among the 12 most important philosophers writing today. Having received in 2007 both the Kyoto Prize for Arts and Philosophy and the Templeton Prize, and with the recent publication of A Secular Age, it's obvious that Professor Taylor's influence has not only continued, it has never been greater. He has spent a good deal of his career in his home of Montreal at McGill University. Their principal and vice chancellor, Heather Monroe Bloom, characterized Professor Taylor's legacy as this: Professor Taylor has set an outstanding example of how a university professor can change the world. We're honored to have him on our campus to share his thoughts and engage our community. As I mentioned, born in Montreal, he received his bachelor's in history from McGill University. He then moved to England to study at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he completed undergraduate and graduate degrees in philosophy. His dissertation was advised by Isaiah Berlin. He has published on a wide range of philosophical topics, including Hegel, theories of identity, multiculturalism, modernity, and the human sciences. Many of you have been strongly influenced by his extraordinary achievement, Sources of the Self, and perhaps only more extraordinary is his more recent work, A Secular Age. In his work, he shares with us his belief in the importance of recognizing the role that religion and spirituality play in our understanding of ourselves and our world. We cannot adopt, in his own words, a stripped-down secular outlook without any religious dimension or radical hope in history. Professor Taylor was described by John Templeton Jr. upon the awarding of the Templeton Foundation Award as having staked an often lonely position that insists on the inclusion of spiritual dimensions in discussions of public policy, history, linguistics, literature, and every other facet of humanities and the social sciences. With this position, there is a deep resonance with the ethos of Georgetown, our very motto, Utrique Unum, taken from St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, meaning both into one, speaks to the joining of faith and reason that is at the core of our Jesuit tradition, our heritage of scholarship. In our work here, in the work of the Berkeley Center, the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center, our program for Jewish civilization, and in so many other areas, we seek to explore the spiritual dimensions of human action. As I said, in the next 3 days, we have the extraordinary privilege of having Professor Taylor here among us in our community. In the following 3 lectures, he will present a survey of the master narratives that have underpinned secularization, specifically exploring the master narratives of modernity, the meaning and implications of disenchantment and reenchantment, and the relationship of Western secularity with present political religious mobilization. So I'm thrilled to be here this afternoon with all of you, and I look forward to these lectures and to the discussion that they will generate on our campus. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Professor Charles Taylor.
Well, thank you very much, President DeJoy, and I'm very pleased and a little bit rattled by that very, very positive introduction. And I'd like to say how pleased I am to be here at Georgetown. I know that you have this running, continuing dialogue going on between different faith positions and none, and so it's in this context that I'm very, very pleased to have a discussion about what I'm going to try to present. Now, what I'm going to try to present, I'm afraid I was asked to lay out 3 titles, and I laid out 3 titles, but then when I thought about it for the different lectures, it may not quite work out that way. So let me try to explain a very simple structure of these lectures, and I don't know how much I'll do today and how much tomorrow, how much the next day, but this is the very simple structure. I don't know if this says something about my age. There's many, many years ago, there was a popular song about gangsters in Chicago called Put the Blame on Mame. I don't know if you would ever, nobody here knows this, that really dates me and so on. But anyway, each verse, somebody does, they're good. Each verse describes some terrible doings of gangsters in Chicago and people being shot up and so on. And then the refrain came back saying, that's the story that went around, but here's the real lowdown. Put the blame on Mame boys, etc. Well, that's the structure of my lectures. I'd like to give a little bit first the story that's been going around about secularization in the West, and then when I have, I hope, deconstructed that to some degree, will come the real lowdown. And so exactly when I move from phase 1 to phase 2, I can't entirely predict, but let's try to dive into it right now. So part of what I want to deconstruct is what people call the secularization thesis, but it's going to come to be bigger than that. Now, the secularization thesis, which was common in sociology a couple of decades ago, was roughly speaking that modernization brings about secularization. I mean, modernization is something that was broken down into a series of different developments that we're all familiar with: economic growth, industrialization, higher education levels, science and technology, social and geographical mobility, urbanization, globalization, mass communication. You could go on in this list, and the different variants of the thesis, of course, picked up different features of this list, but roughly developments in this area were thought to have brought about in the West secularization, and that was generally understood in terms of 2 developments: that religion ceases to dominate the public sphere, public life, and so in one variant becomes privatized. Of course, that was a great oversimplification, and Jose Casanova's work has already shown how that was a great simplification. But I'll come back to making that slightly more, I hope, sophisticated later on. The second development, apart from this moving religion out of the public sphere, was meant to be the decline of faith and practice. Of course, not equally, maybe some more than the other, but this decline. And the thesis was, you see, I mean, these latter developments have in one sense or other occurred, particularly decline of belief and practice in the West is undeniable, though very unequally between societies, very much more in some society, very much less in the other. But what I want to take as a target is the explanation of this in terms of these various forms of modernization. Now, why this is important, I hope will also, I mean, it's not just a kind of scholarly, abstract discussion about history, what happened in history, because when you unpack this, you see that a great many assumptions about religion, spiritual life, and so on are built into this thesis. Deconstructing that, you also get a new take on what this religion is like today. I mean, what the spiritual options are today. So all these things ride on understanding properly what came about in the last few centuries. And once again, I'm confining myself to the West. That's also going to become evident. There's a polemical point to that, which I'll bring out later on. Now, this secularization thesis is one of two that have been circling around in the West, right? There were, in the 19th century, one saw a lot more, I mean, not a lot of secularization theory as a whole, but those who were propounding the idea that modernity brings about secularization had a much simpler thesis generally. I'm thinking of Ernest Renan, for instance, the French author in the 19th century of La Vie de Jésus and so on, who had this very clear and lapidary quote that I'm going to read you. Il viendra un jour où l'humanité ne croira plus, mais où elle saura. So a day will come when humanity no longer believes, but it will know. And these meant faith on one hand, science on the other. Science will come to the point where no one will have any motivation to believe anymore. And that was, I mean, lots and lots, Auguste Comte, lots and lots of people articulated this kind of view. Modernity, if you like, drives out religious faith for the simple reason that it brings in its wake modernity. Science, and science will show that religious faith has no foundation. Now, you still hear that today, but it's not the center of those, I mean, the central point of those who believe that religion is on the decline. You hear it from the sort of angry atheist fringe and so on, who keep pounding the table, why hasn't religion disappeared and so on. But you don't, the mainline theory, which dominated the academy for the 40 or 50 years after the Second World War, you might say, or 30 or 40 years, was this other one that I'm going to talk about. Let's say that there's the Renan one, which is the rationalistic theory, you know, that science drives out religion. And there's the more subtle sociological one, that all these various, or some subset of these developments that I've been describing, urbanization, social mobility, et cetera, they create social conditions in which religion can't sustain itself, and it eventually withers away with some, you know, rearguard action. A very good book to read this in is relatively recent, 2000, I think, one by Scottish sociologist Steve Bruce, God is Dead. This is a very catchy title, where he tries to take account of the various criticisms that have been made and bring this thesis back again, right? So I really want to talk about that sociological thesis, because that's the one that people still cling to. Now, I want to do this, though, by taking a step back, and this by looking at this particular thesis as embedded in something much more powerful and more pervasive, which are what I want to call master narratives, a set of master narratives of Western modernity. Now, what do I mean by a master narrative? Well, I mean exactly what various postmodernists who attack master narratives mean by it. That is a kind of general encompassing story of how we got to where we are today, reaching quite far back in history, perhaps, which is also, can be in many, many cases, mostly actually, is held in a rather implicit way. People haven't worked this out exactly. They don't know the detail, but they have this kind of general sense that that's the thrust. And this story provides the context which gives meaning to the events people are going through. So it's one thing to have, I lose my faith, my friend loses his faith, and so on. It's one thing to see that, well, it's just an individual event. It's another thing to see this as part of a massive movement through history which is coming forward and bringing about this kind of event as it goes along. It gives a quite different sense of the meaning of this particular event, to see it in that context. Now, a lot of people say that, of course, master narratives are a terrible thing. This is what Jean-François Lyotard and others said at various times. These are dogmatic schemata that we sort of push onto reality, and we fail to be able to see what's going on, and we have to scrap them all, have to do away with master narratives. This would shorten my lectures by about 2.5 hours if I did it, but that's not the reason, I assure you, not the reason why I'm resisting this particular suggestion. I'm resisting it because I don't think it's possible. I think people always tend to understand themselves in terms of some big scale narrative. The only remedy for a bad, oversimple, not reflected master narrative is a better, more complicated, more elaborated, and consciously expressed master narrative. We can't really get away without them. And if you listen to people around you, you can see that people are, even in the vocabulary they use, they're using terms that don't make sense outside of a master narrative. For instance, some idea can be condemned as medieval, positively medieval, or another idea can be praised as progressive, or some figure, perhaps some figure we're writing about in the past, can be praised as being ahead of her time. I just read Florence Nightingale. I mean, she's ahead of her time. It's quite a interesting concept. I mean, we just take all these things in and we understand them. We think we understand them immediately, but when you think of this term, it doesn't make sense unless somehow times are allotted to different stages of development, right? And she was at a stage that normally is coming much later on. She was kind of forerunner, or behind, somebody else is behind, and so on. And that person, if they get far enough behind, they're positively medieval. Now, it's very interesting that everybody understands this language, even people who've taken not honors history, taken no history at all. I mean, and they know very little about history. And you say to them about French Revolution, when did that happen? Yesterday? No. They have no knowledge of the detail of history, but they deploy this vocabulary, and this vocabulary carries with it a certain set of assumptions. So we have to, I think, recognize that these are relatively unavoidable. And when you think back in human history, you can see that something like this has always been going on. I mean, not this kind of narrative. That is something which is to do with our kind of civilization in the modern West, and maybe in modernity now we've kind of foisted this on everybody in modernity in general. But human societies from the beginning of, when we have any record of them or can have any access to them, they've always had a way of placing what they're doing now in the cosmos and in time. And if you like, in cosmos time. It could be a cyclical view of the cosmos, like the Aztecs. Every 52 years, the cosmos goes through a cycle. And so we place ourselves at the stage we are in the cycle. Or it could be some idea of a golden age that we've since fallen away from, or a heroic age, like the Greeks with the Homeric heroes, that we've fallen away from, we can't really reach, but we're trying to imitate, we're trying to use them as models. And then we get, of course, in our religious tradition, the notion of an eschaton, of an end of things, which on the contrary is not simply a falling away, but is a new creation or a new going to a higher level, etc. Well, my case I'm trying to make here by just a few suggestions, and somebody will get up after us and tell me that there are exceptions, but what I'm trying to suggest is that we almost always have this placing of the events we're living in now in some kind of larger framework, touching its place in the cosmos and its place in time, even if this isn't a place in time of the kind that we recognize with our linear narratives. It's a cyclical time. Nevertheless, they're so placed. And that's why the only way to get rid of a master narrative altogether would be perhaps if we could recur to something like the Stoic idea of the great year, in which a cycle in which the universe ends up in a conflagration and starts again. We always have some kind of larger picture. Now, we in the modern West have this kind of picture, which is really what people very roughly call a progress picture, but it's more complicated than that. We can see that we're the heirs, in a certain sense, and modifiers of the Renaissance, European Renaissance, historical consciousness, master narrative, which was that there was a magnificent period, the ancient period, where literature and the clarity of human thought and the perfection of writing achieved a kind of level. And then we dropped off from that, and we're trying to recover that level again through humanistic studies. And that, of course, is the reading that creates the concept of Middle Ages, the period in between that great height and the height we're trying to climb back up to. And then this is modified in the famous quarrel of the ancients and the moderns, where some people begin to say, on the contrary, modern literature has achieved heights that ancient literature didn't attain. So we're not simply trying to climb up to their level, we're going beyond them, quarrel around Shakespeare, around what that represents. And finally, we get the kind of master narrative that I want to point to, which crystallizes in the 18th century, and with major figures like, for instance, of the Scottish Enlightenment, like the two Adams, Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, with the idea that human history can be understood in terms of stages. And I'm going to call this as stadial theories, because it's to do with stages. My computer insists that stadial isn't properly English, but I've decided to rebel and declare independence. I hope that you understand. I mean, stadial theories, which begin to be defined in terms of the way in which human beings at a given stage made the means to life. So one very common one was humans were originally hunter-gatherers, and then they were nomads, and then they had agricultural societies. And then now, in the 18th century, we find ourselves entering into what was called commercial society. And the understanding behind this was that these different stages brought about quite different, what we would call today, cultures. I mean, most notably, the thing that people talked a great deal about, Hume talked about, all the Scottish Enlightenment talked about this, and it later becomes a commonplace with a lot of European thinkers, is that the agricultural stage, particularly as we saw it in the ancient polis and also in the Middle Ages, was one in which war, warriors going to war and making conquests and so on, was a very privileged activity, but either because by conquest you could gain resources, or at least you could prevent others from conquering you. So war became a very important activity. The property everyone thought of the commercial society is that it puts the emphasis on production and exchange, for which peace is an absolute condition. War is a catastrophe. War, as it were, greatly reduces the overall pie which you are trying to share in. And it privileges peaceful production. And so you get a different kind of human being coming to the fore, different kind of, what we would say today, values become central, right? So commercial society comes about, And this is can be thought to be a great advance on two grounds. First of all, begin to see the idea of growth, continuing growth, as it were, not as in history before, where you have prosperous periods after non-prosperous periods, and then a crash because of a war or a famine and so on. We go back down again, and up and down, but we never, as it were, go through a certain ceiling, but rather the prospect of continuing progress, continuing economic growth. Secondly, so that's on the, if you like, material level, but on the human level, it's thought, well, surely we all agree that making peaceful production and exchange our top goal is much higher than making war our top goal. And along with this idea of peaceful production and exchange goes the notion of greater and greater intercourse between human beings at farther and farther ranges, right? The business of trade is the business of trading all over the world, and so we get eventually kind of increase of the zone in which people feel themselves at home with people like them, not just their narrow village, not just their nation, but the whole world. Or in terms of certain 18th century theories of sympathy, our immediate sympathy for other people grows beyond for our family or our village and so on, and becomes eventually a sympathy that we feel for all human beings. And the ethic which springs from sympathy, that we treat people properly and so on, is something that we now experience as, or see as, universal ethics. So we have this idea that in this stadial theory is built in the notion that we're making progress, we're getting there. Now, we'll see that secularization theory slots into this mold of stadial theory, in the sense that it's seen, I mean, by certain, as it were, ways of working this out, see religious faith itself as being something that belongs to a certain age, and that age in the past, something that we've gone beyond. And the important thing about these stadial theories is that, and I want to look at them in these two, always in these two frameworks, they're supposed to explain our own Western progression, our own Western history, but they're supposed also to be universal. So we rapidly get the notion that what the stages we have been through are stages for all human beings, and we can understand other societies that are, quote, behind us as existing at earlier stages, and therefore, in a certain sense, we are charting their future, and they are helping us to understand our past, right? So these are the two ways in which the stadial theory is played out. So let's look at some of the issues that arise from this, because I've given the very simple, very upbeat version of it all. But from the very beginning, you find that there were doubts and problems. I mean, the two great Adams, Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson, yeah, they thought that modern society is one in which there is a more, as it were, emphasis on and endorsement of peaceful production. But they weren't sure that losing the heroic ethic of the ancient polis and republics was necessarily an unambiguously good thing. They had a lingering idea. You see this in Ferguson's work, you see this in Smith's work. Those who take the trouble to read through The Whole Wealth of Nations, which obviously most neoliberals haven't done, will see that various pages farther on, you get this notion surfacing. Well, perhaps a free society, a society which can maintain its independence and also have some elements of self-rule in the population, requires, here there's an influence from Machiavelli coming over a number of centuries, requires people who are also not just citizens, but as citizens ready to be warriors, ready to be part of the army, right? So a simple emphasis on peaceful production doesn't necessarily produce a citizenry that can maintain free institutions. There's a sense here of there's a real dilemma going on, right? So I think I want to look at these stadial theories in a few different frameworks where we can see emerging various kinds of ambivalence. The stadial theories, the idea of moving from a stage to the other, had three possible consequences. Right? It had the consequence, on one hand, of, it could be conceived as having the consequence of relegating some kind of activity or some kind of value or some kind of sets of norms to an unrecoverable past. That was okay then, that's possible then, but it's not possible now. Right? And you could think of that, sort of unrecoverability notion of such a thing as the warrior ethic of the ancients. I mean, for instance, Benjamin Constant, you know, at the end of the French Revolution, after the French Revolution and the Restoration, writing his very, very famous, I'm sure some of you have seen this in your courses, La liberté des anciens comparée à celle des modernes, the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. He makes exactly this point, which is drawn from the stadial theory, that in the ancients they had an idea of liberty which consisted in having a say in the life of the polis. It didn't matter, and indeed, nobody was asking for personal independence. As a matter of fact, in those polis, in those republics, they had a very austere notion of the right morality, and they imposed it on everybody. There was no question of people deviating from this. So there was nothing like what we would call today negative liberty, but there was this positive liberty in the sense that you, as a citizen, you had a say. You were part of the decision process. And we, the moderns, Constant says entirely buying into this, or three-quarters buying into this modern stadial view. We moderns don't have that idea of liberty. For us, the commercial society, we want the independence to act the way we feel we want to act. Right? And that's why, I mean, this is Constant's reading of what was terribly wrong about the Jacobin phase of the French Revolution. They, following Rousseau, made the terrible mistake of trying to make moderns live like ancients, and we can't do that. That's not our way. You read, there again, you've got to read to the end of the lecture. And then doubts begin to creep in. I mean, we also want to have, I mean, they were speaking in the time of the Restoration. We don't want to go back to, you know, the absolute monarchy. We want to have some kind of input from citizens through a regular constitution and representative institution. So the question arises in his mind, maybe we need some kind of mix of the two rather than simply modern as against ancient. Okay, so there is this one thing you could think about is that stadial theory could say whatever you want, you can't go back. Another thing it could be doing is saying, and very good too. I mean, well lost. We've not only lost all that, but it's great that we've lost all that. We don't have to have that kind of stuff around anymore. And you know, many people think of this when they see religion in the context of a stadial theory as belonging to the past. It's a world well lost, as it said. And the third thing that you might say is that not only is it a world lost and a world well lost, but that looking at history from the point of view we are now, we understand it better. We get a kind of moral gain, that's point two, and we get a kind of epistemic gain. We understand history better. But each one of these things is contested, so that the actual structure of the stadial theory is really the structure of a set of continuing arguments going on in the West. And those people who accept, I think, too easily the secularization thesis have accepted too easily the oversimplified, not version of a stadial theory, not put in question, not questions raised about whether it was a good thing, questions raised about whether we understand the process better than our predecessors because we have a superior standpoint, questions about whether it is really unrecoverable after all. Now, what I think is true in the stadial theory, or some version of it is true, is the first point. Some things do become unrecoverable. And it's clear that if you look at history in general, that since the development of city civilization and in Mesopotamia in the millennia before the present era, it's been just about impossible to do away with. I mean, certainly barbarians sweep in and they wipe it out, and we have Gibbon walking around Rome seeing the moss growing and all these ancient monuments and so on, but it comes back. It's something that seems to come back. There are certain thresholds we cross in history where it's virtually impossible to bring people back anyway in a permanent way. So there are, let me call these ratchet effects. Like when you pull a ratchet, it clicks and you can't, as it were, get it to move back. There are ratchet effects in history, but the great issue is identifying exactly what they are, and then facing the issue whether these are unambiguously good things with gains and no losses, unambiguously bad things, and there are various reactionary theories which say that they are, and whether, thirdly, they're properly understood only from one or other standpoint. I mean, the certain reactionary theories that say that the development of modern equality, for instance, has made impossible community among human beings, imply not only that we've lost a great deal, but that we don't even understand anymore what we've really lost. Only people who had one foot in the old world, people like Burke, I have to somehow make a compromise between my irrepressible tendency to gesture and these, I'll stand back. So only people like Burke really understand the world that they were just in the course of losing. So this is all to say what I'm going to try to do here. What I'm going to try to do here is not oppose or scrap master narratives as such. I think that's futile, and I think it's not really helpful. But what I think we ought to try to do is seek a serious version of some kind of stadial theory, where we first of all identify correctly the ratchet effects, what things really are relegated to the past, and raise seriously the issue of whether, when these exist, they're simply gains, simply losses, or, as I would almost, in most cases, want to argue, a mixture of gains and losses. So we have to take the master narrative, which is going the rounds in an unreflective way, and purge it of its naivete, and purge it of the confusions and elisions in its unthought. To use that expression as impensé, the sort of unreflected elements in it, which you find in these master narratives. Okay, so I now want to launch into a set of criticisms of very common versions of this stadial master narrative, which I think have tremendously damaging and obfuscating confusions and elisions that are unthought. Now the first is about the very structure of them. I've said at the beginning that for people like Ferguson and Smith, the important definition of the stage came in terms of the way people produced the means to life. I mean, as hunter-gatherers, agriculture, commercial, and so on, which is not to say that they anticipated Marx necessarily in holding that there's some causal priority of these. I mean, this could just as easily be a kind of, as it were, upheld by a Weberian thesis that it took some kind of cultural change. In Weber's case, took some kind of cultural and religious change in order to launch modern capitalism, right? So it isn't connected with some causal thesis, but it is connected with what I would call a kind of bundle thesis, that you can't have the important, interesting institutional changes, like a new way of making a living for human beings, without certain cultural changes. That you couldn't have, for instance, modern capitalism without a certain kind of individualism. You couldn't have modern capitalism without a certain kind of work ethic, which in this case is founded on some relationship to the original Protestant view. This, as a theory, is part of the unthought, and it has catastrophic consequences when you start to look outside the European case, because what it does is it canonizes a certain constellation, which did indeed go together, certain cultural changes and certain economic changes in the European case, or in some of the European cases. And it imagines that this kind of thing is always going to be happening in any other case where the same institutional and practice changes come about. And that, of course, just isn't the case. As a matter of fact, when you begin to break down even the Western case into sub-cases, into different national and regional and cultural itineraries and trajectories, you see that already very simple elision of certain elements of modern culture and certain kinds of economic development won't work. But this is a very powerful idea. I mean, people in the New York Times, Tom Friedman, maybe not fair to him, but no, I mean, they say what's needed in these other places is they have to get a notion of individualism and the importance of education and the importance of production, and drop all that other stuff, and then they'll be able to go through the proper courses. But of course, that's not the way it really works. I mean, to give a sense of how much that isn't the way it can work, look at something like Indian democracy. We always say India is the greatest, the biggest, I mean, the most extensive democratic society, and in some sense this is certainly true. I mean, it's maintained, you know, Dalian polyarchy, representative institutions, you actually can turn over the government, it happens from time to time. But the way in which mass democracy has come to India, connected in many cases with the mobilization around caste or groups of castes and so on, is so out of whack with what people understood as the development of democracy in the West and its rising at the same time as individualism and so on. Indeed, one of my favorite authors, Tocqueville, I have to say that, you know, he wrote, as well as writing on America, he wrote on India, and he said, can't be a ordinary polity here because of the importance of caste. I mean, you know, poor Tocqueville, I don't want to hold him to this, and I don't want to say that, you know, this is a catastrophic mistake. Who could predict? But just an example of how the way in which certain, in this case, institutional structures, I mean, in a certain sense, it's exactly like Westminster. It's exactly, I mean, exactly like Canada, because it's Westminster system in a federal structure. There's tremendous analogies between the Indian constitution and ours, but the way in which the thing actually functions, the way in which political mobilization actually takes place is tremendously different. And its difference, as it were, reflects the quite different context out of which it grows. Okay, so right away, maybe I don't need to hammer this point anymore. Maybe what I want to say already now is I want to justify the fact that my talking about this, my writing about this in my book, and my talking about secularization here with you today has been confined to what I think of as Latin Christendom and some of its successor societies. I do that deliberately because I think that we can write some kind of fine-grained story about this, or even this may be too big a subject. But we can't assume from that that this is going to be a trailblazing template for other parts of the world. And I think this point needs less hammering than it did when Weber wrote, and it needs even, I mean, it still needs less hammering than it did 20 years ago. I think this is getting evident to everybody. So I won't go on about that. Let's go on thinking about the Western case. Well, another big, I think, mistake in the simplified version of this stadial theory is what I call its weakness for subtraction stories. Now, by subtraction stories, I mean stories that see these developments of modernity that I described earlier, mobility, industrialization, and so on, as having the effect of undermining previous contexts, which in turn had the effect of inhibiting some tendency which is in human beings in a more or less timeless way. I mean, this very simple version of subtraction stories you very often find is human beings are at base, if you like, util maximizing individuals, right? They are individuals who seek maximum utility. Now, this, if you go back to Hammurabic Babylon or the medieval France and so on, this tendency was severely hemmed in by the reigning conception of authority, of community, what we owe to others, what we dare do, the ways in which we do or do not dare deviate. So this tendency was not at all in evidence in the way it is allegedly today in a modern capitalist consumer society. What was needed was simply removing that context, and this normal human tendency will simply emerge. And then, of course, we have a whole lot of stories of how certain modern developments, for instance, the tremendous degree of social and geographical mobility which the last 3 centuries have brought about. In the West, people travel across oceans to set themselves up in America, or they travel from the countryside to the industrial suburbs of Liverpool, or they move socially even without traveling and so on, because they've become capable of rising and becoming more rich, and therefore breaking the bonds of a certain class position, which went along with certain idea of what their consumption ought to be and how they ought to dress and so on. So you can look at this whole set of developments as simply breaking obstacles to what? Well, to the underlying, if you like, human nature. Now this is perhaps this particular notion turning around instrumental individualism, so that's a very simple and crude one. It's one you find more commonly in the utilitarian type theory. But this kind of theory can exist on a more refined level. I mean, on a Kantian level, even dare I say. I mean, this is with Kantian philosophy, we're at the very antipodes of any kind of crudity and so on. But the same kind of idea that we end up, when we get rid of the earlier conditions that are hemming us in, we end up as beings who want to make judgments which are universally acceptable. Or we have another version of this, which is not a subtraction story, is not quite right, but it has the same kind of effect. A story like Adam Smith's attribution to human beings from the very beginning of a tendency to truck and barter. Right? They are always, as it were, engaging on a small scale in barter and truck, ameliorating their situation. But of course, this is at the beginning very hemmed in, only with a few neighbors and exchanging a few things. With the implantation of markets, where one is beginning to exchange with much broader and broader bunch of people, with the extension of markets so that more and more things that enter into human life pass through the market. We don't, even to the point where now we have families are kind of no longer units that are free from the market, but each one is getting income and more or less exchanging services and so on. This tendency to truck and barter, as it were, universalized itself, or as it were, breaks through all the barriers. And that gives us the kind of behavior we see in a modern economy. Now that kind of theory, you see, it's sort of like a subtraction story, but a little bit more complex than that. It's not simply subtracting certain obstacles. But what it assumes is that there is some set of tendencies in human nature which are perennial, sempiternal. And what we see emerging in later stages is these tendencies in their pure, unadulterated, as it were, unimpeded form, right? So that's the kind of account which lies behind lots of readings of the stadial story. Now, it seems to me that that is clearly wrong. That what one has rather than that, as one moves from one stage to the other, as one moves, for instance, from the agricultural society of feudal Europe to the commercial society that's growing up in 18th century Europe, is you have Okay, I'm going to use a word which I'm then going to cross out, surrature, but I can't find any other way of doing it. We have the construction of new kinds of identity, new kinds of understanding of what the human good is, of what it is to be a human being, of what we should aim at, of what the excellences are. Now, let me come to the rature. Construction is a bad word because it implies two things. But at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to give me the correct word, and I'll finally get out of this dilemma. It's a bad word because these things are not consciously constructed. When I talk about constructed, the development of a new conception of the free individual, or the fully responsible individual, or the individual seeking his or her authenticity. These are three kinds of individualism that have developed in the West, is not something which somebody sat down and constructed. It's something which is constructed over a long period of time by certain changes, the earlier members of which had nothing like this in their sights, but it ended up producing this. So constructed doesn't mean consciously constructed, but it does mean the development of a new kind of human being with new kinds of norms and standards by which to judge human life. Secondly, constructed is bad if it implies that anything goes. It's just, anything could be constructed, any kind of human, new kind of human agency could be constructed, because plainly some attempts succeed and others don't. That is, you have to see the ones that succeed. I mean, let's take this example, which is very relevant for us today, the example of the modern Western individual, now universalized, the ethic of authenticity, that I owe it to myself to become what I really am, find my true identity and act it out, not to accept simply being, taking over models from my society, from my environment, from my parents and so on, and applying them to myself. Now, that understanding of the human being and human excellence, it could easily have been the case that, as did happen, various elite writers and so on in the Romantic period began to talk about that, and it could have been the case that that just never took on as a kind of mass phenomenon, even as some Fourierists and other socialist writers in the 1830s talked about a society of total, as it were, altruism, where people would just operate with others with total anarchic freedom, but at the same time without any conflict, with a complete consideration for the welfare of others. That was another idea put forward, but it plainly hasn't taken on. So the fact that some of these constructions, all unwitting as they were actually possible, tells us something about human beings. They do answer, if I can use this, recur to this Aristotelian language, which still sounds right to me, they answer to a certain potentiality of human life. So in that second sense, they're not constructed either. So what am I trying to say with this term constructed? I'm trying to say that we have to go through, and we do go through, important transformations in our very understanding of what it is to be a human being, and we do go through those in history, partly because the drift of the whole culture around us pushes us through them, and partly because when we are pushed through them, we, if you like, relate to them, we take them on, we assume them, we take them up with a sense of, yeah, this is what it's all about. But the important point I want to make here is that that kind of, okay, I want to go back to calling it, that kind of constructive activity is totally ignored by subtraction stories. And that's where they make a really terrible mistake. If you take this fact of construction, and the way I'm using it, seriously, the notion of the direction of history being fixed from the beginning, direction of this stadial development, being fixed from the beginning by certain constants of human nature that just need to be liberated and just need to have the obstacles taken out of their way, rather like a good football game where every possible tackler is blocked and so on. If you think of it that way, then of course it would have been possible way back then in the very beginning to have predicted the the direction of human history. And of course, it'll be possible, now we go back to the error, the ethnocentric error that's often built in here, it would be possible now, seeing the full flowering of instrumental individualism in our culture, to say that's human nature, it's just a matter of time before all these other societies do likewise. You can see that this tendency for ethnocentric projection of the Western trajectory is partly intellectually based on the tremendous grip of the subtraction story. Once you accept that, we innovated in various rather surprising ways. I mean, the development of the, if you like, individual concerned with his or her authentic development is something no one could have predicted. It's a very interesting Western development. It's not necessarily promised to be a development everywhere, or to the extent that it is borrowed, it may be borrowed like Indian parliamentary democracy, it may be borrowed with such an incredible degree of new readings and variations on it that it won't really count as the same kind. Once you get out of the grip of the subtraction story, the temptation to, if you like, ethnocentrism, ethnocentricize, if I can put it this way, in looking at the Western trajectory, largely falls away, right? So that, along with my criticism of the structure, is a criticism I want to make of our stadial theories. Now, perhaps this is a place to break. I have one or two other such criticisms, which I think I'll make, because I'd like to have a time for discussion, which I think I'll make at the beginning of tomorrow's lecture, and then the real lowdown will start. I will start with an attempt to reconstruct a better, I mean, I'm sure it's going to be, change and change again, but a slightly better stadial story of the kind that is directly relevant to understanding the processes of secularization in Western culture. But let me leave you with where I am now. It's always going to be a confusing place. So let me leave you, and let's have some questions and objections and strangled cries of protest.
Thank you. As you can see, this is going to be an ongoing conversation. We have about 30 minutes now. There's a microphone at the center of the room. I'd ask people to line up if you have a question and introduce yourself briefly and keep your question brief as well so that we can get through as much material as possible.
Could you briefly characterize how your view differs from other thinkers like, for example, Hannah Arendt or Jürgen Habermas?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a big story in each case. See, I don't think Hannah Arendt really tackled this problem of, I mean, she wrote some extremely interesting work on the modern democracy, on the I think she's one of the most important 20th century writers trying to understand that great tradition of thought that you can call civic humanist. That is the ideal of citizen self-government. I think she relates it brilliantly to the ancients, and she writes very tellingly about it. But I don't think that this whole issue of how we developed from the Middle Ages to the present was really very strongly on her radar. I may be wrong about that. But Jürgen Habermas, you're absolutely right. This is exactly covering territory that he tries to cover. And I think that, and I'll make some of this criticism at the beginning of next time from another angle, tomorrow another angle, but let's go at it now. He has a notion, a very Weberian notion, of the differentiation of spheres. This is, one of the really, really big themes of standard sociological secularization theory, that the difference between us and earlier societies is that certain activities which were carried on before without being clearly distinguished and differentiated from other activities like politics and economics, now have developed a set of norms, set of how-to, a set of jobs and functions and so on, making an entire sphere, right? And Weber tries to argue this into one of the possible causes of decline of religion. That's not Habermas's route, though, but Habermas tries to distinguish three spheres and to put forward the striking idea that one of the big sort of crunch points of the big ratchet points, the big points where we pass into a new era, is where you see, as he thinks, that the criteria for correctness in these three spheres are radically different. So there's a sphere of scientific fact gathering where we all understand that, and he is absolutely, his face is set against various kinds of postmodernism. There is a right and a wrong here. He used to think this was something that could be explained away in a Peircean theory of convergence, but he really has abandoned that. So it can be thought of as purely, correspondence theory of truth. And then there's leave the aesthetic sphere aside because it'll take us away from, it's very interesting. But the really crucial difference is between this sphere I just described and the normative sphere. And there's a completely different criterion for correctness, which is something like a development of the Kantian one, that it's a norm which everybody in a situation of free debate and so on could endorse. That's the correct norm. So it doesn't correspond to anything. It's not like Aristotle corresponding to human nature and so on. And I think this is where Habermas uses this expression of post-metaphysical ethics and so on and so on. So I think you have this massive, really, if this were right, a really massive stadial theory. The trouble is that all of us are still wandering around in the earlier stage, not realizing we're making nonsense of ourselves and so on. But this would be a massive stadial theory of you can't go back. I just don't see how this stands up, frankly. We could go into that at some level, some depth, but it is a very interesting and very powerful stadial theory, inspired by Weber.
Yes, my name's Robert Goff. I'm a non-academic, so I might be asking a non-academic question, but I was, as far as take a libertarian notion, I was wondering if you truly believe that the notion of free will that is actually the free will that humans exercise is actually different over the centuries, and how do you reconcile your constructionism theory, that's the term you used, with the idea that free will among people have pretty much, in my opinion, seem to have stayed constant over the centuries?
Well, I can see a sense in which you can define free will, in which also define it as constant, but which doesn't seem to me to enter into conflict with, as you say, constructivism. And I'm really feeling I feel a certain amount of inner tremor at that word. I'm sorry I launched it, but that people become, in a certain sense, very different. They come to understand themselves and to seek norms that are very different. But in all cases, they exercise choices. And they exercise choices how to live up to or whether to live up to these, or they, even to a certain degree, you could argue, because this is part of the self-understanding of the age of authenticity, they have some say in even defining more exactly what their identity is, right? It's not simply choosing like that, but right? But in all these cases, no matter how you define the human being, whether you define the human being that way or a way in which there is one single model of what it is to be human and you either live up to it or you don't, there are important choices to be made, and we're always making them, right? So the problem with any fatalist or determinist theory is making sense of our experience of choice. There are moments when we know we can go this way or that way, and it's very important which way we go, and we hesitate and we think about it and we deliberate and so on. And that, I think, is always part of our lives. I don't know if that helps. Probably not. No.
Ibrahim Kalin, Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, Georgetown. I have two questions, or one question with two parts to it. First one is, in the earlier part of your presentation, you talked about the theories of modernization leading up to secularization, and you basically said that they turn out to be false, not able to explain what's happening in the world today. Even though you didn't use the words, but I assume that the underlying argument or reasoning was that religions are back. They're coming back in different forms in different parts of the world, from politics to spirituality. Now, my question is, within the context of your explanation of secularization, is what is the modality of the coming back of these religions? How are they coming back? Are they coming back as if like without being affected or tainted or colored by what happened over the last 2 centuries in the Western tradition and the rest of the world? Or are they creating their own identities, in different contexts? What's the modality of their coming back? And secondly, give the example of India. And I know your interest in the non-Western world also to a certain extent. So my question is, how do you read the developments, the major intellectual developments outside the Western tradition, as far as the narratives of modernity are concerned? The reason I ask this is, even though there are these multiple readings, parallel histories happening, I gave the example of India, different mode of democracy, and all the other core values and institutions that support that kind of democracy are kind of rising and becoming part of the discourse. But there's also an urge to basically go with the stadial theories that you were explaining, that there seems to be more sticking to that way of thinking, that since the West has gone through all the stages, the non-Western world somehow has to go through some of the stages so that we can compete, we can share the power, we can share the wealth of the world, etc. And that seems to be driven not just by some will to power, but some very practical realities. If you want to compete with modern capitalism, global institutions and multinational corporations, you have to do what they have done or what they're doing. So is there a way, I got the sense that you want, there's some hope in what you say, in the sense that the stadial theories are not necessarily true. There are other ways of looking at these things. But in terms of practical necessities, what is the likelihood of something different happening on a global scale?
Well, these are two very, very good questions. Thank you for them. First, about return. I don't like to talk of return of religion, because I think people who do that only do that because they lost sight of it in the first place, and then they were blindsided or surprised when there were certain phenomena that they couldn't deny anymore. But the second reason why I don't want to talk of return of religion is, you hinted at the end of your question, I think a lot of the new forms are genuinely new. In other words, religion is not a single thing. It's there are tremendous variety of different religious phenomena over all of human history, over different societies, and even what we think of as the same religious tradition can go through various mutations and changes. And I'll talk about this particularly in my third lecture, but a lot of the forms of mobilization around religious markers today are quite new. Are unprecedented in the various traditions, right? So for those two reasons, I don't like to talk about return. I like to talk about people once more noticing religion, and a lot of things they notice are new, what I call recomposed forms. And that has certainly knocked the post-war sociological theory off its perch. The figures like, I'm going to quote Peter Berger of an earlier epoch tomorrow, who now has turned totally around and saying it's all a big mistake, it wasn't a theory. Okay, the second point you make, I think, is very, very well taken, and that's one of the reasons why there are things like ratchet effects, that certain kinds of cultural changes in the West have gone along with certain institutional changes to produce, for instance, the modern bureaucratic state, the modern disciplined army, the modern economy, which grows constantly and therefore can support a larger and larger armed force. And this is something which other societies have to find, if you like, a functional equivalent to, or they will be taken, which they were, for many were for centuries taken over as part of European empires. And the ones that avoided this, like Japan, was because they made moves to bring about, if you like, functional equivalences of these practices. Now, what's interesting, and the reason why the stadial theories are severely wrong, is that they did this on the basis of other kinds of cultural changes, right, which made sense in their tradition, but were not carbon copies of the Western ones. So in a certain sense, there is here what I call a ratchet effect. That is, you can't function in the modern world in the end without something like a Westphalian state, something like a bureaucracy, something like a market economy, something like et cetera, et cetera. You can make a list of these institutional musts. If you don't have that, somebody will take you over and build that kind of thing anyway, right, in your society. And then you may have to throw them off and then build it yourself. But what that entails in the way of cultural change is tremendously different. And it's that which gets lost from sight in the Western stadial theory.
Thanks so much for this first of your lectures. My name is Patrick Lee Miller, and I'm at the Center for Hellenic Studies here in Washington. I have two related questions about subtraction stories, and they're both about the Greeks. First of all, you mentioned Aristotelian potentialities, and yet you're also talking about construction. And as you know, because you were the first to teach me this, that the Aristotelian potentialities connote a language of teleology and human nature, and how is that compatible with the construction stories? And then the second question is about, yes, you make very good criticisms of subtraction stories, but where then do subtraction stories fit into your own stadial theory as historical moments? And I'm sure we'll hear about that more, but my anticipatory question is that yes, they appear in the 17th and 18th century full-blown, but they're also there in the Greeks with the Sophists, and especially in Thucydides, where you get in the Athenian plague or the Corcyraean revolution, these moments where societies are stripped away, and Thucydides thinks we all revert to a fundamental human self-interested nature.
Yeah. Okay, so these are several very interesting questions there. I mean, let's go back to Aristotle. I'm borrowing from Aristotle, but I'm making terrible amendment or deviation, which I think you have to, if looking at it from modern conditions, if you want to take up some bits of the Nicomachean ethics, which I do, that is, you have to accept that human cultures are tremendously different. So even the list of virtues are going to be different, but not only that, but human cultures change over time, so that the same society, if you like, France or whatever you want to call it, this century and that century, it's two different cultures. And so what you have here is a conception. I still want to hang on to the conception of potentiality. Why? Well, because I think one of the most powerful experiences that Aristotle and Plato were building themselves on, this is not the only thing they did, but was this sense that we have that this is right, we were made for this. This meets something really deep in our nature, and we didn't understand it as fully as we might before we realized it, but now we do. I think that is very, very deeply rooted in human beings. So you take the example I'm using here, which is the modern ethic of authenticity. I mean, what is that but the idea of, there's a certain way of being which is mine. In what sense? Well, what I ought to develop, what really corresponds to me, it corresponds to what a potential, the word almost forces itself on us. But I've made this very, very big, I think, but necessary from our standpoint now. We've seen so many cultures go by and become so different ourselves from what Aristotle's Greeks were. So I think it's an amendment I'm making. Now, is it like Thucydides? I don't think it's like these subtraction stories are like Thucydides in two ways. That yes, it's when you say people get reduced to that, And we all would like to say this at certain circumstances. Terrible, appalling stories of what it's like, and in concentration camps where people become almost animals and so on. People get reduced to the animal, but we don't think of that as the constant tendency of human nature, as it were, which reaches its happy outcome if we just strip away the conditions that hem it in, because we don't think of, at least I don't think, I mean maybe some people do, we don't think of the fact that people could behave in an appalling way as some obstacle being taken away from what they always want to be. We think of it as them in terrible state of deprivation, and I would hate to be that way myself, and I don't know, I wouldn't go there, but it's not, see, it's totally different. We're talking about something in a quite different conceptual space, because this is not the proper fulfillment of human nature. It's not something which is produced by, as it were, removing obstacles. Now, there are some people who do claim that certain violent behavior, who want to argue that certain violent behavior arises when you lift, this great Lord of the Rings by Golding, right. The picture there is you lift the headmaster and the various discipline from these boys, and this terrible thing emerges. Yeah, but there again, you see, it's not the whole story. I mean, Piggy is fighting. You see, this a quite different kind of story. So I think that it's utterly different from subtraction stories. What place do they play in my narrative? None. I think they're totally wrong. Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I hope it. Yeah.
Michael Lame, unaffiliated. I wanted to ask you to comment on monotheism. It seems to me that among those master narratives of Western modernity, there's the idea that with the medieval or the primitive, there's polytheism and idolatry and paganism, etc., animism, and then of necessity, as people progress in their thinking, they move towards monotheism. And there's a whole progression there of Judaism beyond paganism and Christianity as the new covenant, and Islam is correcting the corruptions of Judaism and Christianity and reestablishing the true religion. And I'm wondering why? Is there some reason why monotheism is associated with modernity? As a maybe part of that unthought, of course, as people progress, they will move towards monotheism. And also, is it that will be essential if there is going to be a religious alternative to secularism in the modern era? Will it of necessity be a monotheistic religion?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think there's several levels of answer, and another level, I'm going to talk a great deal about this tomorrow. But there's a very interesting point you're making there, because obviously, the Christian revelation and later on the Muslim one were perfect cases of supersession, of ratchet effects, so you can't go back, right? I mean, as each conceived it. But I think that the way in which this plays out in the modern West requires we bring in more stuff, and I'll just mention it, but we'll talk about it more tomorrow. It requires we bring in the whole idea of reform. That these monotheistic religions are in a context where they have various practices which they see as left over from the earlier period, and the life as lived is a kind of uneasy balance between these, ritual practices which are sometimes called magic, and the drive to get rid of these altogether is a very important part of the story. The drive in particularly Western Latin Christendom. So we're going to see that's a very important part of the story. Whether it's the answer, I think it's part of the problem, not part of the answer. I mean, I think that a very naively and badly understood reform movement is part of what produced all this. But I want to make that case tomorrow, so come back on me tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christian Golden. Thanks for the lecture. So I have a quick question about the ratchet idea. Just like you to clarify that, if you might. One thing you might mean by that is that because the initial presentation, the idea had it that there's something about the past that's irretrievable. There's no
Yeah,
going back
you
in,
can't
a
go
strict,
back,
in
yeah.
a strict sense. So I don't think that's a very plausible reading of what one might mean, because, you know, contemporary industrial civilization might annihilate itself. It might happen with the nuclear technology that it's given rise to, right? I mean, it almost happened in 1962, according to some people, right? So it can't mean, if we talk about rationing, if it's to be plausible, it doesn't seem like it can mean that we can't go back, we can't revert. Our way of life might disintegrate and revert in some sense, or be replaced
in
by
that sense, yeah. Right, yeah.
an
Yeah.
agrarian or completely, you know,
Oh, yeah.
pre-sedentary sort of
Yeah.
form of life or something
You're
like that.
right.
So there's a strict sense in which it's possible, right? So what one might mean then is that it's not rationally possible, that it would be a really bad thing if that were to happen, which implies that there's kind of an inherent tendency, so long as things are going well, so long as we would be in a position of wanting to evaluate them positively, that they would not go in that direction. So I guess one part of the question is, if we disclaim this sort of strict reading of the sense in which we can't go back, which seems false, is there an evaluative component to this language of rationing that seemed belied by the descriptive characterization that you gave of it first? And I guess I'd like you also, if you could, to distinguish between the language of not going back and the irretrievability of the past, and whether there's an evaluative component there, from the language of there being preconditions for going from one stage of development to another, which was an idea that you associated with the language of rationing in an earlier response to a question. Because that would seem to be much different from the idea of irretrievability. It seems like that's the idea of a certain set of conditions that have to be fulfilled to the extent that we go forward, which is a separate idea from the one of not being able to go back.
Yeah.
So could you distinguish these things and clarify the idea a little bit?
Yeah, very good point, yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, it means you can't go back net of some terrible catastrophe. But it doesn't mean simple, or it doesn't mean you can't go back rationally or some kind of normative. Let me give you an example. So after the restoration of the French monarchy, after the revolution and so on, you had Louis XVIII, and then he died, and his younger brother took over, who was a real reactionary, Charles X, and he thought, we got to get back to the full Ancien Regime monarchy. So I'm going to have a coronation ceremony at Reims, exactly modeled on the Middle Ages, including people coming up with scrofula. And the thing, you know, it fell completely flat. I mean, no one knew what the hell's going on here. I mean, what is this all about? That assumes a whole society which is moving along with all that symbology and so on. And he couldn't do it. Now, it's not that it was irrational. You know, maybe from his point of view, he read Domestre and so on, it would be the best possible thing you could do for France would be to have the sacred monarchy back again, back even before Louis XIV and so on. But there were certain preconditions, if you like to put it that way, which were just not present. So you could present yourself the project, but you couldn't carry it out. See, that's really a purely factual. I mean, you may agree with that, thinking, oh, what a terrible shame, you know. We could have saved France and saved Europe.
So that way of putting it disclaims any idea that there's kind of an inexorable tendency in history to go in one direction rather than another. It's just the
That's
idea
right. I mean,
to
a
the extent
ratchet
that it does,
effect,
certain
yeah.
conditions have to be set.
A ratchet effect can be noted independently of what direction you think it's going. That is, people with opposite normativities can, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Yossi Shane, and I'm a professor here at Georgetown. Thank you for giving us so much. And I want to go back to your first point that you made. You made a very interesting dichotomy between the scientific story and the sociological analysis of that. The scientific story is such that you do not start to deal with it, but it has sort of a feeling to it, that it has a universal truth to it. Much more sort of like something which is more coherent, cohesive, perhaps unimpeached in that respect. In sociology, however, there's so much noises in the system and so many variations here, so perhaps we have to stop looking for the, as you say, the master narrative, because the master narrative will confuse us. So perhaps we kind of like, because of the difference between human nature and science, or maybe there is not, I don't know, you choose the other to say, look, perhaps we don't want to look for the ultimate answer here. Or maybe there is something there that science itself failed us in what you began, that once we know, we will stop to believe. Perhaps knowledge here is more lacking. So that's kind of the dichotomy that it perhaps is
Yeah, I think that
eluding us.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I get the question because you see, I'm denying both versions of the
Yes.
theory. Now, it seems to me one is easier to sweep away than the other. That is the scientific one. I mean, look at the New York Review of Books a couple of numbers ago. You had Steven Weinberg giving his usual account of how you can't believe in God anymore. Well, part of it is based on the idea that, well, we're all made of matter, right? I mean, we can understand our our brains and thoughts in terms of our brains and our brains in terms of matter. And there's a massive non sequitur in the argument because obviously I can't think without my brain, but it doesn't mean that understanding why I'm thinking what I'm thinking can be accounted for in a scientific terminology which doesn't recognize purpose, intention, and so on, which of course standard post-Galilean scientific terminology doesn't, and which is the source of its great success in the things that it deals successfully with, that it doesn't acknowledge that. So there is this massive unargued premise behind the view that science rules out God, which is that everything that happens with human beings can be understood by a neurophysiology which is not enriched with any of these concepts that actually make sense of our lives, and therefore, etc. So this is pretty well confined, this particular view that religion must disappear because of this, is pretty well confined to people who are still hanging on to. Now, there's lots of them, but they're not as respectable in the world in the Republic of Letters as they were at one time. So we look at the sociological theory, and that is trying to show, not that religion is wrong anymore, but that it's bound to wither away because it depends on, let's say, for instance, certain kinds of social relations which are being undermined by these sociological developments. It's a different kind of thesis and much harder to chase down because it's more complex and so on.
But is the question that you talked about that we are using certain language which has certain assumptions about it, and of course the example that was mentioned again of India, for example, but we still can understand the same language. We still can look at the same phenomena and identify it, notwithstanding the variations, and notwithstanding the pattern that we have arrived at a certain manner, that we can still look at it and say this is a democracy, and this is a democracy. There's certain principles that we can agree upon that exist within this evolution, even if it is not a complete evolution, and that's the Weberian, in fact, the whole idea of Weber, in my opinion at least, with this whole notion of the ideal type style. Mm-hmm. This is how it works. It will not work always, and in his own critique of India or other religious practices. But there is something there that's how it evolves, and even if it's...
I don't really see that, because you take any kind of ideotypical categorization, well, somebody might argue, well, India is so different from what we think of as democracy. Look at Jyoti Basu with the Communist Party in West Bengal, and so, of course, he's not there anymore, but but his successors and so on, is that democracy? I mean, we could have endless arguments about this, about whether we shouldn't throw away all our basic categories and start again in the light of this phenomenon, or whether we should simply say it's not a democracy and therefore save our category. I mean, we're arguing this kind of thing all the time. These are essentially contested concepts. You see what I mean? It's not, there's nothing.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Joe Early. I'm a chemist here at Georgetown. You mentioned that you weren't happy with the use of construction.
Construction, yes,
you
yeah.
erased it, but then
I know, I'm taking it back all the time.
And you asked for another verb.
Yeah.
There's one that comes to mind. It's used quite a bit in scientific discussions these days. It's not widely generally accepted, or widely accepted but not generally accepted. And its use in the scientific sense is somewhat different from its derivative sense, its linguistic sense. I'm referring to the concept of emergence. And you could say these things emerge.
Yeah.
Now you have a different voice there. This is not the active voice. So, and now you've certainly heard this word, and even J. Gwan Kim has discussed it at some length, but you don't need. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, I note that certain people that I know, philosophy and science and so on, they go ape when you see emergent because they think that you're trying to smuggle in various things and so on. I don't like sending them ape. But I think that we can give, in every given case, in any given case, quite a good circumstantial account of how these new forms emerge. So just saying emergence doesn't really get to it. What I'm trying to characterize is some way of describing the human agency involved in this, right? And that's, which is why I reached for this word construction and then immediately shrank away from it, right? So unless I get another word which can characterize the human agency involved, I'm not off the hook yet. I still am stuck with this.
You want to characterize the human agency?
Yeah, there is a certain human agency involved.
The word emergence means, in its origin, just something pre-existing coming out of the the ocean. So some dragon coming up out of the ocean. But that's not the way it's used. It's used as a new ontological level emerges, but not necessarily with human.
Yes, and so it's very useful.
Conscious.
Yeah,
it's in one sense not human.
yeah,
If it's not conscious, it's not.
That's
It's
right.
not a human act.
yeah. So I think it has a very good place in the whole discussions of evolution, though, as I said, it sends certain people up the wall. And so.
Yeah.
But it's not going to get me off my hook. Thank you very much for trying.
Thank you.
I think we have a homework assignment for tomorrow, so thank you.